In the 1800s, Senator Henry Beauregard was a man of two worlds. In the marble halls of the Capitol, he was the picture of Southern refinement, silk cravats, polished silver, and a voice that dripped with the false honey of tradition. But when the sun dipped below the damp horizon of his plantation, the statesman vanished. In his place stood a predator. Beauregard didn't just own people, he hunted them. He turned human desperation into a spectator sport, using a pack of blood-trained hounds to tear down any soul brave enough to dream of the North. He believed he was the ultimate master of the swamp. He believed no one could outsmart his steel-trap mind. Until he met the man the world called Fat Eli. To the overseers, Elijah Carter was a broken, slow-moving joke. To the senator, he was a sluggish beast of burden. But beneath that layers of forced silence and the scars of a failed escape, Elijah was a strategist. He wasn't running from the hunt anymore. He was redesigning it. This is the story of the night the hounds went silent, the lanterns failed, and the most powerful man in the South realized that in the dark heart of the swamp, he wasn't the hunter. He was the bait. Senator Henry Beauregard was the living embodiment of a terrifying Southern paradox, a man who curated a public image of absolute refinement while harboring a soul of jagged glass. In the grand, humid ballrooms of the state capitol, he moved with a practiced elegance that commanded the room, his voice a melodic baritone that spoke of ancient honor and the unbreakable sanctity of the law. To the high society elite, he was a pillar of stability, a lawmaker whose fine silk waistcoats and polished silver snuff boxes signaled a man of impeccable taste and intellectual breeding. He navigated the marble halls of government with a calculated grace, nodding to peers with a smile that never quite reached his eyes, yet suggested a deep, paternal wisdom. People saw him as the quintessential aristocrat, a defender of a way of life that he claimed was built on the foundation of structured civilization and the quiet dignity of the land. However, this mask was a thin veneer of civility designed to obscure the grotesque reality of the man who existed when the city lights faded behind him. Behind the closed doors of his study, the lawmaker disappeared, replaced by a cold-blooded tactician who viewed his fellow human beings as nothing more than pieces on a chessboard. The transition from the polished statesman to the brutal overseer was seamless, a terrifying metamorphosis that occurred the moment his carriage crossed the iron gates of his vast, sprawling plantation. The senator's true nature was not merely one of cruelty, but of a deeply ingrained, almost scientific belief in the necessity of terror to maintain the world he cherished. He did not see himself as a monster. Rather, he viewed himself as a master of order, a man whose duty was to ensure that the hierarchy of the South remained undisturbed. To Beauregard, the enslaved people who toiled in his endless, white-tufted cotton fields were not individuals with souls, but property that required constant, heavy-handed calibration to remain functional. He studied the mechanics of fear with the same intensity that he studied the nuances of constitutional law, believing that psychological dominance was the only true way to prevent the fires of rebellion. His plantation was designed with a chilling architectural precision, ensuring that the main house stood as a silent, watchful eye over the low, cramped quarters of the workers. Every fence, every watchtower, and every patrol path was placed at a specific angle to remind those within that they were being observed at every waking second of their lives. He took an almost academic pride in the structure of his control, seeing the suppression of hope not as a sin, but as a necessary triumph of the will. This calculated detachment allowed him to sleep soundly in his feather bed, even as the distant sound of his hounds baying in their kennels echoed through the dark, cypress-choked woods. The demonstrations were the centerpiece of his reign of terror, a horrifying ritual that the senator used to turn the human desire for freedom into a public lesson in futility. Whenever the whispers of escape grew too loud or a young man looked him in the eye for a second too long, Beauregard would announce a hunt with the casual air of a man organizing a Sunday brunch. These were not private punishments carried out in the shadows, but grand, theatrical displays of power intended to be witnessed by every soul on the plantation. He would dress in his riding leathers with the same care he took when preparing for a Senate vote, checking the action of his rifle and the sharpness of his spurs with a cold, rhythmic focus. The chosen victims were given a head start that was carefully timed to offer just enough hope to make their eventual capture more agonizing for the watchers. For the senator, the thrill was not in the speed of the chase, but in the inevitable moment when the prey realized that there was nowhere left to run. He believed that by making the failure of escape a public spectacle, he was effectively cauterizing the very idea of resistance before it could ever take root in the hearts of his people. The sound of the brass horn signaling the start of the hunt became a psychological trigger, a sound that meant the world was once again being returned to its proper and brutal alignment. Central to this nightmare were the hounds, a pack of massive, deep-chested animals that the senator had bred and trained with a singular, bloodthirsty purpose since the moment of their birth. These were not the friendly dogs of a farmhouse, but specialized predators that had been taught to associate the scent of human sweat with the reward of the kill. Beauregard spent hours at the kennels, running his gloved hands over their powerful flanks, whispering to them as they strained against their thick iron chains with low, guttural growls of hunger. He viewed the dogs as an extension of his own will, a biological weapon that could traverse the treacherous mud of the swamps far faster than any man could hope to flee. The handlers were instructed to keep the animals on the edge of starvation before a hunt, ensuring that their drive to track and corner was fueled by a primal, desperate energy. When the hounds were finally released, their baying was a sound that haunted the dreams of everyone on the plantation, a dissonant chorus that signaled the end of another soul's dream of the North. The senator would follow on his white horse, a ghost-like figure moving through the mist, enjoying the harmony between his well-ordered mind and the savage instincts of his beasts. He believed that as long as he held the leash of such terror, his throne of marble and mud would remain unshakable for 1,000 years. The arrogance of the senator was his most defining trait, a towering sense of intellectual superiority that blinded him to the humanity and the cleverness of the people he oppressed. He truly believed that the men and women who worked his fields were incapable of complex thought, viewing them as simple creatures who responded only to the lash and the threat of the dog. This hubris allowed him to speak freely about his patrol routes and his security measures while the invisible house servants moved silently in the background, unnoticed and ignored. He saw their silence as a sign of a broken spirit, never imagining that behind those lowered eyes, a fire was being stoked and a map was being drawn with meticulous care. To Beauregard, the idea that someone like Elijah Carter, a man he mocked for his physical slowness, could ever understand the intricacies of a tactical retreat was utterly laughable. He treated his authority as a natural law of the universe, as certain as the rising sun or the flow of the river, never suspecting that the very order he took pride in was becoming his greatest weakness. His belief in his own invincibility was the armor he wore, but it was an armor that had grown brittle with years of unchallenged cruelty and the easy victories of the hunt. He walked through his world with the heavy, certain step of a god, unaware that the ground beneath his feet had already been hollowed out by those he considered beneath his notice. This mask of the monster was so complete that it created a vacuum where his empathy should have been, leaving only a cold, dark vacuum of calculated self-interest. He was a man who could discuss the philosophy of liberty in the morning and listen to the screams of a hunted man in the evening without ever feeling the slightest tremor of cognitive dissonance. In his mind, the two worlds were perfectly compatible, two halves of a whole that allowed him to maintain a civilization of grace, built upon a foundation of absolute, uncompromising violence. He cherished the fine things in life, the aged brandy, the leather-bound books, the soft touch of fine linen, viewing them as the rewards of a man who had the courage to do what was necessary to keep the world in its place. The terror he unleashed was, in his estimation, a form of high art, a masterclass in the management of human livestock that proved his right to rule over the lesser men of the earth. He walked the verandas of his great house with the quiet confidence of a man who had conquered fear itself, never realizing that he had merely outsourced it to the shadows that surrounded him. But the swamp was patient, and the men he had tried to bury in its mud were beginning to find their voices in the rustle of the leaves and the rising of the mist. The senator had built a prison of fear, but he had forgotten that a prison also traps the jailer within its walls, waiting for the night the keys are stolen. Gemini said, Elijah Carter was a master of the long game, a man who understood that in a world of absolute power, the only true weapon was the illusion of absolute brokenness. He did not fight the senator's cruelty with outward defiance, which would have only invited the lash, but instead wore his perceived failures like a heavy, protective cloak. By adopting the persona of Big Eli, the slow-moving, dull-witted kitchen hand, he became a ghost in plain sight, a man so thoroughly mocked that he was eventually ignored. The overseers saw only a heavy frame and a bowed head, never suspecting that the man they ridiculed was a silent observer recording every detail of their movements. He played the role of the defeated soul with a chilling perfection, gaining weight and slowing his pace to ensure no one saw him as a threat. This calculated submissiveness was his greatest tactical advantage, allowing him to move through the plantation's most sensitive areas without ever raising a single eyebrow of suspicion. Behind the mask of the simpleton, Elijah was a brilliant strategist, a man whose mind was as sharp and cold as the steel of a hidden blade. The art of being underestimated required a level of discipline that few men could ever hope to maintain under the crushing weight of a life in chains. Elijah knew that the senator's greatest weakness was his own ego, a towering pride that made him believe no enslaved person possessed the capacity for complex thought. By appearing to be too soft to fight and too foolish to plan, Elijah created a safe space where he could observe the enemy's patterns without interference. He spent years in the smokehouse and the kitchen, absorbing the casual conversations of the white men who spoke freely around him as if he were a piece of furniture. He memorized the precise timing of the patrol shifts, the specific temperaments of the various handlers, and the exact locations of the senator's favorite hunting blinds. Every insult thrown his way was a brick in the foundation of his plan, a piece of intelligence that confirmed he was successfully hiding his true self. He transformed the psychological trauma of his earlier, failed escape into a shield, letting the world believe he was a man who had finally learned his place. Working in the kitchen gave him a unique vantage point, a hub of information where the secrets of the great house were regularly spilled over plates of hot food. Elijah became an expert in the mundane, noticing the subtle shifts in the senator's mood and the specific preparations that signaled an upcoming demonstration or hunt. He learned which dogs were the most aggressive and which were slowing down with age, information that would later prove vital in his sabotage of the kennel. While he hauled heavy barrels of meat and scrubbed blackened pots, his mind was busy mapping out the terrain of the northern swamp with an architect's precision. He understood that knowledge was the only currency that could buy him a chance at a different outcome, and he hoarded it with a desperate, quiet intensity. The very people who looked down on him for his physical size never realized that his slowness was a deliberate choice designed to conserve his energy for the night. He was the invisible witness to the senator's routine, a man who saw the cracks in the master's armor long before the master even knew they existed. Elijah's psychological warfare was built on the principle of the mirror, a strategy where he would eventually use the senator's own predictable habits to lead him into a trap. He realized that the senator hunted the same way every time because the man believed his routine was a demonstration of total control over the landscape. Elijah saw this rigid adherence to structure not as a strength, but as a fatal flaw that could be exploited by someone who is willing to be flexible. He began to prepare the land itself, working in the dead of night to dig shallow pits and mark hidden paths that only he could navigate in the dark. He didn't just plan an escape. He planned a reversal, a scenario where the hunter's expectations would be turned into his most dangerous enemies. By anticipating every move the senator would make, Elijah was able to stay 3 steps ahead, turning the familiar plantation into a foreign and hostile territory. He understood that the greatest fear is not the unknown, but the moment when the known suddenly and inexplicably fails to behave as it should. The patience required for such a plan was nearly superhuman, involving months of tiny, incremental actions that would only make sense on the final night of the hunt. Elijah saved small amounts of strong liquor and crushed peppers over a long period, hiding his supplies in the cracks of the smokehouse walls where no one thought to look. He practiced moving his large frame through the brush without making a sound, learning to step on roots and stones to avoid leaving a clear trail in the mud. He studied the wind and the way sound traveled across the water, figuring out how to create the illusion of numbers using only a few strategically placed horns. This was not the desperate flight of a man running for his life, but the cold, methodical movement of a man reclaiming his own narrative. He took the senator's belief in his own superiority and sharpened it into a weapon, waiting for the perfect moment to strike at the heart of the system. His slowness became a weapon of misdirection, a way to ensure that when he finally moved, no one would be looking in his direction. In the end, Elijah's strategy was to break the senator's spirit rather than his body, knowing that a dead man becomes a martyr, while a humiliated man becomes a ghost. He wanted the senator to feel the same cold, creeping uncertainty that every enslaved person felt when they heard the baying of the hounds in the distance. By managing the senator's fear, Elijah was able to strip away the man's sense of authority, leaving him alone and shivering in a swamp he thought he owned. The reversal was complete not when Elijah crossed the border to freedom, but when the senator realized he had been outthought by a man he had spent years mocking. This psychological victory was the true end of the hunt, a moment where the internal power structure of the plantation was irrevocably shattered by a single mind. Elijah proved that no matter how many chains a man wears, his mind can remain a fortress that no master can ever truly hope to breach. He left behind a story that would travel faster than any dog, a story of a man who turned the hunter's own pride into a nightmare of his own making. The technical neutralization of the senator's hounds was a masterpiece of biological sabotage that required Elijah to move with the precision of a chemist. He understood that a tracking dog does not see with its eyes but with its nose, a delicate instrument that could be overwhelmed by the right combination of scents. For months, Elijah had been quietly harvesting the residues of the smokehouse, gathering concentrated amounts of cayenne pepper and the sharp, stinging dust of dried tobacco. He knew that the senator's pride in his undefeatable beasts was a vulnerability, as the handlers had grown complacent, believing no enslaved man would dare approach the kennels. Elijah volunteered for the most grueling tasks involving the dogs, scrubbing their iron-barred cages and hauling their heavy water buckets with a submissive, mindless expression. This proximity allowed him to study the individual temperaments of the lead trackers, identifying which were the most impulsive and which were the most reliant on their handlers' commands. He was not merely feeding animals. He was mapping the sensory world of a predator to find the exact point where its instincts would fail. The actual execution of the sabotage began in the pre-dawn shadows of the smokehouse, where Elijah prepared a final, tainted meal for the unsuspecting pack. He took high-fat scraps of salted pork and soaked them in a potent mixture of cheap corn liquor and the stinging peppers he had hoarded. The alcohol was intended to dull the dogs' nervous systems, slowing their reaction times and clouding the sharp focus required to maintain a scent trail in thick mud. Meanwhile, the crushed peppers were designed to create a persistent, burning thirst that would force the animals to break their formation in search of water. Elijah moved through the kennels with a practiced, rhythmic calm, tossing the treats to the hounds who had grown to associate his scent with the arrival of food. The dogs devoured the oily meat with a frantic hunger, unaware that they were consuming the very thing that would strip them of their predatory edge. By the time the senator arrived to inspect his hunters, the poison was already circulating through their bloodstreams, slowing their hearts and softening their once lethal drive. When the hunting horn finally echoed across the southern fields, the failure of the hounds was not immediate, but a slow and agonizing unraveling of the senator's certainty. The lead dog, a massive beast known for its relentless pursuit, lunged forward with its usual ferocity only to stumble as the liquor began to take hold. Its nose, usually a heat-seeking missile for human sweat, was now overwhelmed by the internal heat of the peppers, causing the animal to sneeze and shake its head in confusion. The handlers cursed and cracked their whips, but the dogs were no longer interested in the game, their eyes glazed and their movements heavy and uncoordinated. They began to circle aimlessly, their once unified baying turning into a dissonant series of whimpers and frustrated growls as the scent of Samuel vanished into a cloud of spice. The senator watched in stunned silence, unable to comprehend how his biological machines of war had suddenly become as useless as common curs. He did not realize that the slow man standing by the kitchen door had effectively blinded his most trusted soldiers before the first footstep was ever taken. To ensure the hounds remained useless throughout the night, Elijah had also strategically altered the physical environment of the swamp's edge with sensory landmines. He had spent weeks rendering animal fat in the kitchen, mixing it with the pungent oils of wild onions and the sharp, acrid smell of burnt hair. This foul concoction was smeared onto the low-hanging branches of the cypress trees at exactly the height of a hound's nose, creating a sensory wall that masked human scent. As the dogs pushed into the thick brush, they were hit with a barrage of conflicting odors that triggered their territorial instincts rather than their tracking ones. The scent of the rendered fat mimicked the smell of a dead kill, causing the younger, less disciplined dogs to fight amongst themselves for a non-existent prize. This internal chaos broke the formation of the hunt, forcing the overseers to dismount and physically intervene, which further slowed the senator's progress into the dark water. Elijah had turned the swamp into a kaleidoscope of smells, ensuring that the dogs were fighting a war of confusion while Samuel moved quietly through the shadows. The final blow to the pack's effectiveness was the introduction of the liquor, which began to affect the dogs' physical stamina just as the terrain became the most treacherous. Tracking through a swamp requires a dog to maintain a high level of cardiovascular output, a feat that becomes impossible when the heart is slowed by heavy spirits. As the dogs waded into the deeper channels, they lacked the muscular coordination to navigate the slick, underwater routes that Elijah had intentionally exposed. Several of the animals began to flounder, their breathing ragged and their focus entirely lost to the physical discomfort of the spice burn in their throats and stomachs. The senator's pride, Titus, was the only dog to maintain any semblance of a trail, but even his legendary nose was struggling against the chemical interference Elijah had deployed. The pack was no longer a weapon of terror. It was a liability, a group of confused and sickened animals that required more attention than the prey they were supposed to catch. Elijah had successfully decoupled the hunter from his hounds, leaving the senator to rely on his own fallible human senses in a world that demanded animal instinct. In the morning light, the sight of the elite hunting pack returning to the plantation was the ultimate testament to Elijah's hidden genius and his mastery of the canine mind. The dogs were caked in mud, their tails between their legs, and their eyes reflecting a deep, drug-induced exhaustion that no amount of whipping could cure. The senator's authority had been built on the idea that these animals were an extension of his own divine right to rule, but now they stood as proof of his vulnerability. The handlers whispered among themselves, wondering if the swamp itself had turned against them, never suspecting the kitchen hand who was already back at his pots. Elijah had not only saved Samuel, he had permanently damaged the reputation of the hounds, planting a seed of doubt in the hearts of every man who relied on them. The dogs would eventually recover, but the myth of their invincibility had been buried forever in the thick, spicy mud of the northern swamp. He had proven that even the most ferocious beast is only as strong as its master's ability to protect it from the cleverness of the invisible man. Elijah did not just run into the swamp. He transformed the geography of the wetlands into a series of lethal, mechanical surprises for the senator. He spent his few hours of rest hauling heavy logs and digging narrow trenches along the only firm riding paths that could support a horse's weight. These pits were shallow enough to avoid immediate detection, but deep enough to snap a horse's leg or throw a confident rider into the mud. He covered these traps with a delicate lattice of reeds and a dusting of dry earth, making them indistinguishable from the surrounding forest floor. When the senator's party charged forward with the arrogance of men who owned the land, the ground literally vanished beneath their hooves. The sudden chaos of screaming animals and tumbling men broke the riders' formation before they even reached the thickest part of the tree line. Elijah had studied the physics of the hunt and realized that momentum was the senator's greatest ally, so he built his traps to kill that speed. The most cinematic and terrifying of Elijah's inventions was the fire on water, a trick that defied the natural laws the senator believed he controlled. For weeks, Elijah had been surreptitiously dumping buckets of rendered animal fat and thick kitchen grease into a narrow, stagnant channel of the northern swamp. Because oil is lighter than water, it formed an invisible, flammable skin across the surface, stretching from one muddy bank to the other like a trap. As the senator and his remaining overseers closed in on the bayou, believing they had finally cornered their prey, Elijah stood calmly on the far side. With a single, fluid motion, he tossed a lit pine knot torch onto the water surface, and the dark channel erupted into a roaring wall of orange flame. The sight of the water itself burning was a psychological blow that froze the pursuers in their tracks, their horses rearing in primal terror. To the superstitious overseers, it looked as if the swamp had been possessed by a vengeful spirit, but to Elijah, it was simple, calculated chemistry. Beyond the physical barriers, Elijah used the acoustics of the swamp to create a labyrinth of sound that disoriented the senator's internal compass. He had strategically placed several hollowed-out gourds and stolen brass horns in the high branches of cypress trees, rigged with simple vine poles or positioned to catch the wind. When the senator blew his own horn to signal a regrouping of his men, Elijah responded from 3 different directions, creating a haunting, overlapping echo. The sound bounced off the water and the thick Spanish moss, making it impossible for the hunters to tell where the real signal was coming from. This auditory confusion forced the senator to stop and second-guess his direction, wasting precious minutes while the real prey moved further upstream. Every time the senator thought he was closing the gap, a blast from a different corner of the woods would pull his attention away. The swamp became a hall of mirrors, where every sound was a lie and every shadow seemed to hold a dozen hidden enemies. The narrow trails Elijah chose were intentionally selected because they forced the senator to abandon his horse and enter the muck on foot. Elijah knew that the senator's fine leather boots and polished rifle were symbols of a status that meant nothing in a chest-deep mire of rotting vegetation. He led the chase through sucking mud, a specific type of silt that acts like quicksand, trapping anyone who does not know how to distribute their weight. By walking across the gnarled, exposed roots of the cypress trees, Elijah remained high and dry while his pursuers sank deeper with every desperate step. The senator was forced to carry his heavy rifle through thickets of blackberry briars and jagged palmetto fronds that shredded his expensive clothing. This physical degradation was part of Elijah's plan to strip away the man's dignity, making him feel the raw, unfiltered hostility of the wild. By the time the sun began to set, the senator was no longer a lawmaker. He was a muddy, bleeding man struggling against the earth itself. Elijah also manipulated the visual landscape by marking trees with false signals that led the senator toward the most treacherous parts of the bayou. He carved small, subtle notches into the bark of oak trees, mimicking the trail markers that runaway slaves might use to find a path to the north. The senator, thinking he was clever enough to read Elijah's mistakes, followed these marks directly into a dense thicket of stinging nettles and spider-infested brush. Each time the senator found a new mark, his pride convinced him that he was closing in on his target, when in reality, he was being steered like cattle. Elijah watched from the high ground, seeing the lantern light of his enemy bobbing uselessly in the distance like a confused firefly. The landscape had been reauthored by a man who had spent his life observing it, turning every familiar landmark into a deceptive guide. The senator was navigating a map that Elijah had drawn in his head months ago, a map where every destination led back to a state of total confusion. The final trap was not made of wood or fire, but of the senator's own exhaustion, which Elijah triggered by constantly changing the pace of the hunt. He would move rapidly for several hundred yards to create a clear trail, then suddenly double back through the water to leave a cold scent for the dog. This forced the senator to sprint and then stop, a cycle that drained his physical stamina and clouded his mental focus as the night wore on. Elijah used the natural sinkholes of the swamp, deep depressions hidden by floating duckweed, to ensure that any misstep by the senator resulted in a freezing, muddy soak. By the time the moon was high, the senator was shivering and gasping for air, his muscles cramping from the effort of pulling his feet from the clay. Elijah had turned the very gravity of the swamp into an anchor, weighing down the man who thought he could fly above the mud on a white horse. The hunt had become a grueling test of endurance that the senator was never prepared to pass, proving that the land belongs to those who respect it. The final stage of the hunt was not a physical capture, but a psychological execution, where the senator's absolute certainty in his own superiority was systematically dismantled. As the first pale light of dawn began to bleed through the canopy, the once regal lawmaker found himself shivering and broken at the base of the massive, tying oak. This tree, a gnarled monument to decades of suffering, was the very spot where Beauregard had historically broken the spirits of those who dared to dream of the North. Now, the roles were reversed as the senator leaned against the rough bark, his fine clothes reduced to muddy rags, and his expensive rifle uselessly clogged with swamp silt. He realized with a jolt of pure, cold terror that he was exactly where he had once forced others to stand in their moment of ultimate defeat. The very ground he thought he owned had become a witness to his humiliation, stripped of the witnesses and the audience that usually fueled his ego. Elijah did not approach with a weapon, but with the heavy, silent presence of a man who had already won a war of the mind. Elijah stepped from the shadows not as a servant, but as a ghost of every soul the senator had ever tried to bury in the dark mud of the bayou. His large frame, once the subject of cruel jokes and mockery, now cast a towering and immovable shadow across the damp forest floor in the rising mist. There was no anger in his eyes, only a profound and terrifying clarity that made the senator's desperate threats sound like the frantic chirping of a trapped bird. Elijah spoke with a voice that was calm and steady, a sound that carried the weight of the entire swamp and the history of those who had suffered within it. He didn't need to strike a blow because the environment he had manipulated had already stripped the senator of his false and polished veneer of civilization. The lawmaker looked up at the man he had called fat and slow, and for the first time in his life, he saw a mind that was vastly superior to his own. This was the true reversal of power, a moment where the internal hierarchy of the South was crushed under the weight of a single, undeniable truth. The senator tried to summon his old authority, but the words died in his throat as he looked at the hunting horn Elijah held like a discarded toy. This brass instrument, which had once signaled the start of a terrifying sport, was now a symbol of the senator's own predictable and easily manipulated nature. Elijah explained that the hunt was never about the dogs or the horses, but about the arrogance that blinded a master to the brilliance of those he oppressed. He forced the senator to realize that every step he had taken in the dark had been guided by Elijah's hand, a puppet master working the strings of a fool. The psychological weight of this revelation was more damaging than any physical wound, as it proved that the senator's order was merely a fragile and easily broken illusion. He was no longer the great hunter. He was a man who had been led in circles by a kitchen hand while his elite hounds whimpered in the mud. The realization that he had been studied and measured like a common animal left a hollow, aching void in the senator's chest. "Tomorrow, you will return to your great house," Elijah whispered, his words cutting through the damp morning air like a cold wind from the northern territories. "But you will never again walk through your fields or sit on your veranda without wondering which pair of eyes is watching you from the edge of the trees." This was the true genius of the escape. Elijah wasn't just leaving the plantation. He was leaving behind a permanent and parasitic seed of doubt in the master's soul. He understood that a dead senator would be replaced by another, but a haunted senator would become a living warning to every other landowner in the district. The fear that had been the senator's primary tool for decades had now changed direction, flowing back toward the big house with a relentless and quiet momentum. Every shadow in the hallway and every rustle in the cotton would now be interpreted as a sign of a coming reckoning that the senator could not prevent. Elijah had transformed the plantation from a fortress of control into a prison of paranoia, where the jailer was now just as trapped as the prisoners. As the sun climbed higher, casting long and jagged fingers of light through the cypress knees, Elijah began to retreat into the deep, protective embrace of the wilderness. He moved with a surprising and silent grace, his heavy footsteps leaving no trail for a man who had finally lost the ability to track or to understand. The senator watched him go, unable to move or to call out, his body paralyzed by the sheer scale of the psychological defeat he had just endured. He was left alone with his dog, Titus, who sat dejectedly in the mud, both of them reflecting a world that had been irrevocably and violently shifted off its axis. The history of forgotten souls would record this night not as a simple flight to freedom, but as a tactical masterpiece of psychological warfare and human resilience. Elijah and Samuel were gone, but the story of the Fat Man, who broke the senator, would travel through the quarters like a wildfire that no overseer could ever hope to extinguish. The legend of the night the water burned and the hounds went silent would become an anthem of hope for those who remained behind. The final image of the senator was that of a man stumbling out of the tree line and into the open light of his own fields, looking like a ghost of his former self. His overseers rode toward him with questions and confusion, but the look in his eyes silenced them before they could even speak a single word of greeting. He didn't bark orders or demand a new hunt. He simply walked toward the great house with the heavy, dragging step of a man who had seen the end of his own era. The demonstrations stopped that day, not because the senator had found mercy, but because he could no longer bear the sound of his own hunting horn. He spent the rest of his life in the shadows of his study, jumping at the sound of the wind and staring toward the northern swamp with a cold, hollow dread. Elijah Carter had not only won his freedom, he had redefined the very nature of power, proving that a mind fueled by the desire for justice is the most dangerous weapon on earth. The hunt was over. The predator had been unmade, and the story of the outcast would live on as a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit.